So I point that out because under this extended timeline, it's really wise for communities to be thoughtful and strategic about their spending plans.
Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrett Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. Our guest today in the Buzz House is Jolena Presley, a colleague of ours at Baker Tilly, who is a managing director in Baker Tilly's public sector advisory practice, where she focuses on economic development strategy, redevelopment planning, and long-term implementation projects for both public and private sector entities. Today, we're very excited to discuss with Jolena what funding sources state and local governments are receiving from the American Rescue Plan, or ARP, that act, which is legislation, and what dollars municipalities may bring to bear to multifamily properties. Before digging into this discussion with Jolena, we want to give you just a few updates from around the industry. On June 16th, the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University released its annual State of the Nation's Housing 2021 report, which outlines current housing trends, including soaring home prices, which I'm sure you've seen, the shrinking housing supply, and the disproportionately large share of at-risk households facing eviction or foreclosure. The report discusses the unequal impacts of the pandemic for low-income households and people of color, calling on policymakers to take additional steps to ensure these communities also benefit the economy. We will have this report linked at our podcast website, so you'll be able to download that and look at it yourself. On the show, we've recently had many discussions, most recently brought in David Gaston to talk about the Affordable Housing Improvement Act, and it is gaining sponsorship in Washington, D.C. Over the past month, bipartisan co-sponsorship for the Affordable Housing Improvement Act continued to grow in both chambers of Congress. The Senate now has 20 total co-sponsors. They're keeping it even, 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans, which also includes 32% of the Senate Finance Committee. In the House, 64 total co-sponsors. Again, 33 Democrats and 31 Republicans have signed on, including 42% of the House Ways and Means Committee. So very exciting as we continue to watch that roll forward. Just a couple other really quick items. We're sure you're aware that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention announced the extension of the eviction moratorium for this one additional month through July 31st. There was actually a Supreme Court case that got all the way to the Supreme Court. It was voted as a 5-4 vote to actually keep the moratorium in place. One last item before switching over to Jolena is we've talked a lot about housing dollars available for rent, how will tenants have access to dollars and so forth. And very positively, state programs are expected to pay support more than 200,000 renters in the month of July, and more than $1 billion in assistance coming from various federal and state housing programs to cover back rent and utilities to hopefully avoid evictions and homelessness here at the end of July, when the CDC said July would be the last month that we kind of the eviction moratorium. I think I lied. I have one more kind of interesting piece of legislation, state legislation in the state of Illinois. We often look at what are real estate taxes, are there breaks for affordable housing. The state of Illinois just passed legislation whereby if a project has 7 or more units and 35% or more of those units are affordable, they're able to receive a 35% discount of assessed value. So 35% reduction approximately in real estate taxes. So very significant breakthrough there in tax assessment in Illinois. With that background information, Garrick and I are now going to jump in our discussion with Jolena. Garrick?
Yeah, thanks, Don. And that's pretty interesting on the 35% property tax reduction in Illinois. I like that. So we have Jolena as our guest. It's great. Thank you for coming on. But before we go ahead and get into questions, why don't you just go ahead and start out by telling our listeners a little bit about your background and what you're working on here at Baker Tilly's Public Sector Advisory Group.
Sure. Thanks, Garrick and Don, for inviting me to join you today. I joined Baker Tilly back in 2019 after 15 years at a Midwest-based economic development and urban planning firm. There I was a principal leading the Milwaukee office. So I work with both public and private sector entities specializing in economic development strategy, planning, and long-term project implementation. One area of my focus is guiding complex projects through to completion by leveraging funding opportunities across public and private programs. So over the past 20 years, I have worked with municipalities, economic development organizations, and private sector clients to help develop and advance economic development strategies, community revitalization plans, and implementation tools. Throughout this time, I've developed and implemented funding strategies for projects that leverage state, federal, private grant funding, and while also leveraging additional private sector and tax credit investments, working with many of the team members here at Baker Tilly to move development of catalytic community projects forward to completion. So most recently, I've actually been working quite a bit with the American Rescue Plan, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today.
So let's go ahead and just dive right into our discussion. So right now we're seeing some cities and counties talk about some funding priorities. You mentioned the American Rescue Plan funds. So can you give us a little bit of background on these dollars that are coming into these local units or government entities and how these entities can use these funds?
Yes, you bet, Garrick. So to state it simply, we are currently seeing unprecedented investment in our state and local communities by the federal government. So as I'm sure most people have heard, direct funding has started to reach state and local governments, tribal governments, and U.S. territories by way of fiscal recovery funds, which is a funding mechanism through the American Rescue Plan, or ARP. The $1.9 trillion ARP was signed into law by President Biden in March this year, and this provides over $350 billion directly to our state and local governments via the fiscal recovery funds, or more commonly known as the FRF. We always have all these acronyms. So these are funds that are coming directly. Again, this is fairly unusual that every community is going to have this money, which can be used to fill in budget holes, restore cuts made because of the recession, and respond to ongoing elevated public needs over the next few years. So I know I keep stating it, but it really is historic. And this is the first direct aid for many communities to respond to the impacts of the pandemic, which we know are great. So within the ARP, there are also other funds available, so separate from the FRF, that are considered other provisions from federal agencies. And those funds, are basically another topic for another discussion, but those are funds through other entities like the Economic Development Administration, or EDA, EPA for the environmental protection. Those funds are available through allocation or competitive grant applications, and that's a whole nother process. And we can keep you up to date as those come along for application process. But for today, I'm going to talk more about the FRF.
Yeah, thanks. And I did have a question about that. So obviously these funds are there, and everybody's probably wondering how these things are getting dished out, right? So have you seen any city or county give an indication specifically how they may use these funds?
Yeah, so bear with me, this is a lot of information, but it's important. Yes, so we've had conversations with state and local governments across the country as the ARP was first signed into law, and now as communities have started to receive their first allocations. Before I dig into the details, it's important to note that communities have until December 31st, 2024 to obligate these funds, and then they have until December 31st, 2026 to spend the funds. So I point that out because under this extended timeline, it's really wise for communities to be thoughtful and strategic about their spending plans. So while we're hearing, we read in the paper, we hear from our client communities and folks we're having conversations with, that they are starting to indicate how they plan to spend the money. I would say for the most part, communities are in the planning process. They're really thinking about their strategy, and that is something we at Baker Tilly are here to help with. But it's important for them now to really align, how they think it's most important to spend the money to recover from COVID-19. So if you'd like, I can go into more of the detailed in terms of eligible expenses, because there are a fair amount of areas of flexibility for communities as they develop their spending plans. Generally, these funds need to be used to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So that's important to find a way to connect the potential funding strategy to recovery from the pandemic. So there are 5 areas of eligible funding categories, and I can go over that broad list of categories from U.S. Treasury. First is public health and economic impacts. That includes responding to COVID-19. So for example, funding COVID-19 mitigation efforts, medical expenses, behavioral health care, and certain public health and safety staff. The next is responding to negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. So this is economic harms to workers, households, small businesses, impacted industries, and public sector. So this is funding that can go directly to support these folks that were impacted. Serving the hardest hit communities and families. This is huge, and I know that this would be important to you guys as you work with our housing developers and communities. This category acknowledges the disproportionate negative effects of COVID-19 on low-income groups. So these are ways that are not directly economic related. Thus, it allows FRF to be used to address disparities in public health outcomes, invest in housing and neighborhoods to strengthen communities, address educational disparities, and promote healthy childhood environments, which can include investments in childcare. The next major bucket or category is premium pay. This second group offers additional support to those who have and will bear the greatest human health risks because of their service in critical infrastructure sectors. This expenditure allows public sector entities to provide premium pay retroactively and moving forward to essential workers. And this also allows FRF recipients, the communities, to offer grants to third-party employers for premium pay. The third category is replace lost public sector revenue. So we find this to be a popular topic, figuring out how to calculate revenue lost in the time period, and then using this funding to provide government services to the extent the reduction in revenue is experienced due to the pandemic. This is by far the broadest category. It allows FRF recipients to use allocations up to a certain amount to continue the provision of government services, whether or not they are directly related to COVID-19. The next category, number 4, is investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. This is where communities can make necessary investments to improve access to clean drinking water, support vital wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and to expand access to broadband internet. And then the next category, which I like to talk about quite a bit, is the regional and governmental collaboration. So it's a little bit more unique. There is more of an option that FRF recipients have the option to transfer all or parts of their allocation to a constituent unit of government, such as to their state or a special use district. The transferred funds still need to follow into one of those first 4 eligible use criteria categories I gave you, but it does allow the ability for a city or a community to broaden the impact of the funds, because then other entities can use them. In particular, you could think about collaborating with an economic development entity, collaborating with a transportation entity, those sort of things. So within these overall categories, recipients really have broad flexibility to decide how best to use this funding to meet their needs of the communities. I know I just shared a lot, but that it is sort of complex, and there's ongoing updated guidance, but these are the categories and the considerations that our communities are thinking about right now.
So, thanks for that. For us, a lot of our listeners, obviously in the housing industry, excited to hear that, addressing, investing in housing and neighborhoods as an allowable use. So I think, we hope there's a lot more to come on that as cities and counties think through their strategies. So, Jolena, kind of on a little bit of a different note, we work with a lot of developers that are using tax incremental financing for housing development. Have you, seen any trends in TIF or other hot topics around TIF? Any thoughts on that?
I would say we are seeing that with the increase in funds at the community level from ARP, as we just talked about, there is actually less financial pressure on TIF within communities. So in that way, TIF is sort of being used more as a broader economic development tool and not just for blight elimination. There is perhaps, though, more public scrutiny on TIF projects due to the public perception of giving money away when many families and individuals may be hurting from the pandemic. So the result of increased scrutiny is more requests for clawbacks and reporting when TIF is an element of a project.
Thanks, Jolena. This is great stuff. Are there any other funding tools or strategies that you've seen municipalities implement to drive housing and community development type projects?
Yes, overall, I recommend projects with a broader focus or goal to achieve community revitalization take a layered funding approach when developing an implementation strategy. With this layered approach, both public and private resources should come to the table and include all the tools: tax credits, grants, philanthropic investments. And back to the current federal funding opportunities, the ARP does include $42 billion towards housing-related funding. For instance, Title III of the ARP appropriates emergency funding to assist with mitigating housing-related hardships of those who have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. Just over half of that is emergency rental assistance, while nearly $10 billion is earmarked for the Homeowner Assistance Fund. An additional $5 billion is for homelessness assistance and supportive services programs. And also I want to reiterate that the FRF we discussed earlier states that allocations may be used to respond to the negative economic impacts of COVID-19 public health emergency. So to address the immediate economic impacts of COVID-19, we should think about housing insecurity, and FRF funds can be used towards the development and or rehabilitation of affordable housing. In addition to that previously mentioned emergency rental and mortgage assistance. So while ARP and the pending infrastructure package are the hot topics at the moment, they are an additional element of a typical layered approach to public-private project financing. Tools, and significant at that add to the mix of project funding strategy.
Very good. And Julian, thanks for kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture with tools and obviously housing, top a lot of municipalities, tongues and so forth. So really appreciate Juliana's time and insight, and feel free to reach us listeners with questions. And with that, we want to thank Juliana for joining the Buzz House, and listeners, thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for listening to Buzz House. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD@bakertilly.com.